Natan last is a writer, researcher, and policy advocate. He regularly contributes crosswords to venues including The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Hyperallergic. Natan's essays have appeared in such venues as The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Drift, The Atlantic, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Natan's poetry has appeared in journals including Narrative, the Cincinnati Review, and the American Journal for Poetry. His nonfiction book, on the past and present of crosswords across the universe, is forthcoming this year from Pantheon. Natan is also trained as a social scientist focused on migration, political economy, technology, and law. Currently, he develops digital products and policy for refugees and asylum seekers at USCIS. Natan was previously a director at the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project and a founding member of the International Rescue Committee's Innovation Lab. Natan holds a master's degree from Columbia's School of International Affairs in Human Rights and Economic Policy, and he has lectured on subjects including crosswords, poetry, and refugee policy at Princeton, the Harvard Kennedy School, South by Southwest, the New Yorker Festival, and the UN's annual refugee consultation in Geneva. I first got to know Natan when we co-taught for 3 glorious years a crossword construction course through Atlas Obscura. Adrienne Raphel is the author of Thinking Inside the Box, Adrienne says, Thinking Inside the Box, Adventures with, you do, Adventures with Crosswords and the Puzzling People Who Can't Live Without Them, published by Penguin Press in 2020, which was named an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review. Adrienne is also the author of 2 poetry collections, What Was It For?, which won the Rescue Press Black Box Poetry Prize, and Our Dark Academia. Adrienne's essays and poetry appear in The New York Times, The New Yorker, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, Poetry, and many other publications. Adrienne has been awarded a visiting fellowship from the American Library in Paris, named a James Merrill House Writer in Residence, featured as a speaker at the Library of Congress's National Book Festival, the Edinburgh Book Festival, and South by Southwest, and served as a mentor with the Periplus Collective. Adrienne holds her doctorate in English from Harvard University and an MFA in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop. She is currently on the English faculty at CUNY Baruch College and teaches graduate-level poetry and nonfiction with the Mountain View MFA program of Southern New Hampshire University, the Writers Foundry MFA program of St. Joseph's University, and the Berlin Writers Workshop. I met Adrienne 2 years ago at ACPT, and now we see each other like many times a week. So I hope today or this weekend you make a friend as good as I've made an Adrienne.
I love this book. I'm so excited for it to be in the world. And because you were talking a lot about the pandemic and crosswords, and because selfishly, I mean, like, my book sort of like very coincidentally ends right before the pandemic, like launched sort of in March 17th, 2020. And then I think of this as taking up that mantle. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about both how the COVID-19 moment kind of has reshaped, redefined, been this crux for crosswords. You talked about it some here, but both from a solving and a construction standpoint. But then also maybe, like, is that a myth? What was happening sort of before the pandemic to shift things, kind of like just to focus on both that moment and the kind of myth of that moment?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think that, you know, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic about the changes that had been coming to the crossword, people trying to make the puzzle less racist and more culturally interesting, doing a lot of things that people like Brooke at Puzzmo are doing and other outlets. And this has a long history, you know. Incubators 2018. I think there's a generation of solvers that grew up solving the amazing blog puzzles. I mean, I certainly remember solving, you know, Brendan Quigley's blog puzzle like the day Sonia Sotomayor was confirmed, and just seeing that crosswords could not just respond in real time to news, but by codifying names and people in the crossword, help shape and reshape what common knowledge was. And so, yeah, there are these early pioneers. Brendan's like the first person to move to Bushwick, maybe. And then there's like a wonderful generation like Paolo Pasco, Jenna LaFleur, Eric Agard, Sam Ozerski, many others, many people in the room who had blogs and showed that you could be voicey, be interesting, be current in a swell that I think led up to the pandemic, when you get very obviously just people stuck at home. I think you get people being less beholden to the times, maybe in two ways, like capital T times. So wanting to strike out on their own. But I write in the book about people who, many of whom were in like the caring professions and decided in COVID to make crosswords their life in a way that I think is extremely admirable and beautiful and interesting. And that dovetails with this is only possible because, the Times app comes in-house at 2014. A lot of other outlets are gaining traction then, and I think there's just so much attention on the crossword. Wordle is bought by the Times in January 2022, so just a lot of this stuff is happening at once. There are projects like Malika's 7X Words and the Tabula Rasa project, which is run by a blogger named Meat Daddy. I always want to say Meat Daddy into a microphone. And the beauty of both those projects is how collaborative they were, right? It's people who are meeting each other online and sort of project managing with each other, right? Collaborating on a group project. The Tabula Rasa project was a themeless grid that Meat Daddy had constructed, and then they sent it out to something like 100. I can't remember exactly how many, but some number of constructors. And so you got to see this truism that we all live, that every constructor's voice, really comes through in the cluing in addition to the grid selection, the words in the grid. And it was really wonderful to see regular words be clued in, dozens of different ways. So there's sort of two waves. There's like the pre-COVID wave, and then there's the ability for the COVID wave to spread its wings. And then I think the interest in games during COVID means that a lot of the people like Brooke, like Malika, like a lot of the people in this room who really get into crosswords in this era, the economics are such that outlets are expanding. There are editorships available for this sort of new wave who can inject some new life into this game.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how it's kind of this strange perfect storm of events. It's like all this sort of interest building and sort of ability to connect online, and then with like when we're sort of this flip of everybody is inside staring at a box. And also crosswords are really famously great in times of crisis and in times of like international global crises. Like crosswords step up to the plate. They're like, it's our time. We're here. Like in, famously World War II is when the Times starts this crossword. Like I feel like there's something about the and we've talked about this a lot, but the sort of solvable problem as a world becomes increasingly unsolvable.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the interesting things is that the Times takes that stance in 2020, I think reasonably, but people can disagree, to kind of not have COVID at all peek its head into the puzzle. But, when in World War II, the Times finally says, this is right after Pearl Harbor, I think we should have a crossword. Before that, they had this line that was no comics, no puzzles, strictly a newspaper. And it was sort of strictly in that precisely sense, but also in that sort of like the last adult in the newsroom, like a very overweening father being like, no crosswords, no play. But when the inaugural editor of the New York Times crossword, Margaret Farrar, takes the helm, that first puzzle has World War II all over it. That first, many, many months of puzzles talks about, it clues Atlantic as like graveyard for Nazi subs. And it's like, we got them. And, John Farmer, talking about digital preservation, John Farmer, who was one of the Litzers, so these are people who digitized all of the pre-Shortsea and New York Times crosswords, from 1944 all the way up to 1993, project led by David Steinberg, he had a quote that was like, Margaret Farrar was practically enlisted in like the Allied war effort. That like the puzzles really couldn't stop. And it's interesting psychologically, it feels like it's almost blurting, right? How could you not talk about the war? But the COVID puzzle, the COVID thing, it was much more, this is a diversion. This is us finally taking play seriously. We're not going to think about that other thing.
Well, and I think it also speaks to, in both moments, both the sort of explosion from a solver perspective of people looking for puzzles, but also a real opportunity for the crossword and games and puzzles in general, editorship-wise, to kind of assert like, who are we? Because Farrar also is like, the crossword's gonna be the gold standard in the Times. Like, we're going to have a crossword. It's gonna be like really great and adopt all these things that she had been practicing before. And then in 2020, the Times takes that editorial stance. But then, of course, as we know from everybody in this room, crosswords everywhere. Like, there's sort of the ability for a crossword to present and do multiple things also explodes. Like, editors are able to make distinct choices around this puzzle, which I think feels really exciting too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Margaret Farrar story is a really beautiful one because in 1919, when she's the assistant to Arthur Wynne at the New York World, the crossword has like tons of mistakes. The clues sometimes don't match the numbers they're supposed to correspond to. And for a long time, she had been wanting to be a serious journalist and thought this was beneath her. And so she's sort of Bartleby-esque. She says, I prefer not to solve the crossword. It looks good, and she'll pass it on to the typesetters and the people who would hand ink the grids. But then at some point she's like, oh, no, it's a bad puzzle. I'm gonna fix it. And you have this moment of many such moments in history of a woman like fixing a guy's chaotic process.
Yeah.
Where she's like, I'm gonna take over, I'm gonna make this good. And I think somewhat provocatively, she kind of becomes a bit of a product manager for the crossword. She institutes standards. She oversees the process from clue setting to typesetting to hand inking to printing. And she really is the first person to turn the crossword into a standardized product. And that's the thing that enables a bunch of innovation. Before her, grids in the New York World, you could have 3 grids that like spelled out fun with their black squares, but they weren't connected, which is cool and interesting. But with the standards that she institutes, you actually get a lot more innovation. We're both poets, so we're used to standards and rules actually giving life to innovation, right? Which is maybe sometimes unintuitive. But yeah, I mean, she really just changes what the puzzle can be.
Which I think also relates to what you talked to about Nguyen about and about this kind of agency in art. And I think Laura's talk and Rob's talk also speak to this as well. Like this kind of idea of crossword as aesthetic object and this inherent duality between this is something that we're thinking about as this real art form, as this medium, as this formal process, and both like a poetic form and a digital form and a technological form. And also the crossword is designed to be a one-use product, is designed to be something that you fill out and then you like are done with in that way. So I'm curious that but your thoughts about this, like the duality of, okay, the crossword is this like aesthetic thing that we're pouring all this like thought and form and stuff, but it's also supposed to be something that you just like do once. that it's designed for that. How do you square that circle?
Yeah. I mean, the crossword has all these contradictions. It's extremely ephemeral, but the things in the grid have been canonized by dint of being in the crossword. So C.T. Nguyen, amazing philosopher of games, highly recommend his book, Games, Agency as Art.
Games,
Agency as Art. Don't you forget that colon. Well, no. And one of the things he says is, he's a huge gamer and is really interested in how whenever there's a new medium, people describe that medium in the terms of the most proximate medium. So when photography comes out, everyone's talking about it in terms of painting, but we want to think about the things that photography itself can do. And games are no different. People talk about a game's narrative as being novelistic, right? Or a video game's graphics as being cinematic. And those are true pleasures, but the thing that is beautiful in games is the actions. It's kind of us as the game players choosing to do one thing over another. And Joanna eventually thinks of game designers as more akin to city planners than painters, in the sense that they are constructing a world in which certain kinds of sculpted agency is possible. And I feel this every time I watch three speed solvers solve on Twitch or on the big boards at ACPT. I'm looking at three different people make decisions and work their way through a puzzle. And so I think that aesthetic pleasure, the pleasure of striving, the pleasure of striving to finish a puzzle, is one of the big aesthetic pleasures. I also just think grids are beautiful. I think this is separate from whether or not they're sort of art objects, but I have this memory that no one ever likes as much as me, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is I remember solving a really terrible New York Times puzzle in 2007 that was a pun on the phrase "a stitch in time saves 9." And the puzzle, I think it was a quote puzzle, and the answers were something like, "In the case where the stitch is late, do you think it can still save 8?" Not, a question of our times, but I remember solving that puzzle, and the quote required the southeast corner to have a bunch of 7 answers stacked next to each other, and the 3 answers next to each other were chignon. Is that how you say bun? The bun?
The chignon.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't do French. You can do my French. Amphora, the old vase, and nostrum, right? The Latin word. And the words are all from different etymologies, and I was just like, this is a found poem. Those are 3 beautiful words, and I was 16. I didn't know any of those words. And so I think there is a sense in which I remember solving themelesses on Saturday, and of course, if you did it in the paper, the previous day's grid, the solution was in the lower left. And just looking at the grid, at the black square arrangement, but for me, at the mashup of words, right? At the chance connections, as Rob was talking about. That was a huge aesthetic pleasure for sure.
I think too, one of the biggest aesthetic pleasures of the crossword, when in the 20s when it first came out, was the grid. It's still today. I guess last year Diana von Furstenberg was like, yeah, let me use the crossword to celebrate my 50th anniversary. But David Kwong created this incredible grid for her. So the crossword and fashion are inextricably tied together in the same way that it's no accident that the crossword is in the 20s when Mondrian is really popular, and this grid as this incredible beautiful, or Broadway boogie woogies out there, this beautiful thing that you're looking at regardless of what it says. But then the crossword's oh hey, it can say things too.
Yeah, and I think we think of the crossword grid as being this very staid black and white image, but the very first New York World puzzles were inked by Ernie Bushmiller, who went on to draw Nancy, the comic. And those early grids, he'll do a candy cane stripy thing on the black squares. There was a wood finish on one of them. There was much more sort of visual innovation. And part of the reason this chapter is titled A Familiar Form of Madness is because a lot of that innovation is coming back, right? Visually interesting grids are much more possible online. One of my favorite puzzles of all time is a Kate Chin Park et al. Puzzle that is in the shape of a minion. And it's yellow and blue in all the right places. And so, just using the internet totally enables this new visual language that doesn't have to look like a newspaper inky puzzle.
I think we can start thinking about Q&A or from the audience. I'd love to... If anybody has questions.
The authors on that minion puzzle were Kate Chin Park and Kelsey Dixon and Meet Daddy.
Meet Daddy!
Daddy! It is really fun
so
to say into a
let's give
microphone.
Adrienne and Natan a hand before we do questions. All right, who has questions for... Or do you want to get this person here?
Yes.
And this person is Mikkel.
Hi. You alluded to this in your talk, but as folks who do nonfiction, crosswords, and poetry, in what ways do these modalities compete, and which ways do they complement each other?
I think the poetry and the crosswords in some sense seem the closest. And this is a long history. T.S. Eliot was a big crossword lover. Vladimir Nabokov, who's maybe one of the more poetic writers in English, was a huge crossword lover and constructor. He wrote the first Russian language crosswords. The list goes on. But for me, it is that like defamiliarization of the letter, as Adrienne put it so clearly, where, looking at, I mean, like, it's the serious version of grappe, I feel like, where you're just like looking at a word and the shape of it matters much more for a little bit than the meaning. And you're looking at words for qualities that they have outside of meaning. So whether it's word length or rhyme or stress, thinking of words in those ways, I think, renews your wonder at them. I think the research aspect, I will say one thing writing crosswords teaches you to do is to find the illustrative detail that you want to use for a proper noun in particular, both in that Jeopardy way, but also in that kind of vivid way, where a good clue is giving you an important nugget about the thing it's referring to. And I think nonfiction has that same sense of detail, where one sentence can paint more of a world behind it if you pick the right detail.
I think a lot about both the intersection of nonfiction crosswords and poetry, and also about how each of these forms sort of excels at doing different kinds of things too. So, for example, in crosswords, I love how this form really strives to juxtapose things that may not necessarily be found in the same space, like physical space, and yet go there beautifully by this kind of accident of the letters, so the defamiliarization of it. And I think that one thing that I also really like to see in crosswords is the canonization of the notes, or like Brooke does a lot of annotations of like your crosswords, and we've seen, and so many people here like annotate the motion of mind. The motion of mind to get from a constructor's perspective, how to like finding the ways that the answers fit into the grid, and then finding all of the various ways in which you can clue something in a grid. I think that crosswords are sort of like very suited as a medium to exploring both like kind of the sort of beautiful inherent randomness of these mashups, but also finding ways to like backform them to be less random, or to kind of lean into that and accelerate that. I could go on about that, but that to me is something that crosswords are really good at, that actually like poetry and nonfiction, like once you start doing like random mashups, it can just feel kind of forced, but crosswords lean into that forcedness in a way that I love.
Orda, do you want to get Adam here?
Thank you both. Your remarks have been making me think about like the memes, like the notion of a meme, and how memes like carry information and pass it on, etc. Like, could you talk about the relationship between crosswords and memes, maybe like conceptually, which is sort of an annoying question, but also like how you incorporate memes in constructing as well?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, when crossword Twitter really got going, you had this movement that felt like a deconstructed food movement, but for crosswords, where Ross Trudeau, who's an amazing constructor, would often post themes, fully baked themes, no crossword to solve, but the theme was severed from the clues in the grid. It was just, I found this interesting correspondence. Do you like it? And when people now tweet links to their puzzles, they often tweet a single clue, right? Because that's how the software has it. And so I love the Gestalt feeling of solving a crossword, and I'm really interested in how also the individual parts are circulatable in their own way. It's similar to a grid. I mean, you text as a themeless constructor, I'm often texting friends grids absent their clues, and the thing I'm interested in is, does this grid feel alive to you, right? And so, I mean, there's definitely that. I'm, despite that, reading a very silly person, and so I think of memes, as I think has already been said, it makes me think of callbacks, and I love when clues double. I love using the same clue twice. it's actually so part of my instincts that I teach a class called the JASA crossword class, where it's often like 40 versions of my grandma asking me how crosswords get made. And one of the things I often find the most difficult to explain is why a doubled clue is not a kind of duplicate, but is in fact a wonderful callback. It's so intuitive to me that I don't have good language for it, but there is that memification. And I guess the last thing that comes to mind is the way that words themselves, by dint of their letter patterns, recur across crosswords, lends itself to memification. So one of my favorite other projects is Ada's Oreo cluing project, where she got it was 50 constructors to submit. You know, it was like in the end hundreds of clues for the word Oreo, and some of them are so silly and so funny. And you need the base of how often Oreo is clued at all, and how often it's clued in a boring way, to memify it. So I think crosswords are ripe for that kind of thing.
More questions? Oda, right in front of you.
Hi, I am super interested in sort of the juxtaposition of what you were talking about, of crosswords sort of codifying how things that are important to us, with the ephemerality of you solve it once and then kind of toss it to the side. When you're constructing, how are you thinking about sort of preserving the way that we're thinking about a word now to, is it going to be thought of that way in the future?
I think one thing I will say sort of to the opposite end of that, and then I'll let you go just really quickly, is another thing that I kind of love about constructing is actually leaning into total ephemerality, and also occasional puzzles for somebody's birthday, or even for a very specific brand purpose or something that is kind of actually not in this sort of archival, we are codifying how a word is being used, but in a much more either personal or SponCon kind of way. I think that there's a really just to not quite address that, but actually to kind of address it in the opposite way. I think that crosswords, while they offer this kind of amazing opportunity to be a dictionary of the moment and sort of say what are words being used for, I think that there's also this really cool opportunity for crosswords to really lean into the one and doneness and say, hey, you are really special because you're in this crossword, and this in-joke, this meme, this idea that we've had together is actually interestingly codified because I put it into a grid for you, and also discardable because you've solved it in this grid. So I think that crosswords by their form, they make language seem really official and yes, this is now in a grid, it is stamped, and also can seem like a private in-joke. So I just wanted to bring up that kind of really gaminess, not a meat gaminess, but I heard to bring up Meat Daddy one more time into a microphone.
Gaminess.
But just this idea that crosswords solidify things, but they can be really fun.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's spot on. I mean, it makes me think of, is Eric Albert, who's the subject of the first chapter of the book, is kind of the first person to computer generate crosswords. This is back in 1989, where he didn't even tell anyone for a couple of years because he thought he'd lose his edge. But he, before turning to crosswords, made word squares, right? Kind of like the Seder square. So these are, n by n grids, same words reading across as down. And he wrote a program to generate bigger and bigger ones, including ones that were 7 by 7 was the first attempt. And when that one got really good, he told me, he was like, my friends with 7-letter names got really interesting birthday gifts. And I was like, is it interesting? But it is. It's it's kind of fun to just see your name among other words that enable this grid. And it gives your name, which feels a bit like an accident, this kind of heft, right? The Seder squares etched into a column of Pompeii. There's heft when words are next to each other. There's heft when something appears in the Times. And the only thing I'll say about crosswords in particular is sometimes the things get recanonized and reinterpreted because they're already in puzzles a lot. So I talk in the book about the case of the entry Mau Mau, M-A-U, M-A-U, not in puzzles too often, but these are the revolutionaries who threw off British colonialism in Kenya. And in, if you use any of these clue databases, you'll see M-A-U, M-A-U, Mau Mau clued in 1957, 1958, when the rebellion begins, as like African terrorists, because that's how the New York Times international coverage understood that event. You see in the 90s people saying rebels, but this occasionally will still use words like African menace. This is really othering and kind of just straight up fucked up way of viewing this historical event. It's not until 2013 that you see a clue that says something like, Kenyan revolutionaries for independence, right? And so it's the same 6-letter phrase. It's the same historical event, which changes our understanding. And the crossword helps you fix that bad historiography, right? You could change how the same thing is understood, and sometimes you can push how that thing is understood in the international reporting desk as well by the crossword's codifying power, I think.